Sarah Mitchell had always been different from other tourists. While most people snapped quick photos and moved on, she noticed the small details that others missed. The way sunlight caught on old stone walls, how pigeons gathered near the palace, gates, and especially the faces of the royal guards who stood perfectly still in their bright red uniforms and tall black hats. It was a crisp October morning when Sarah first saw him. She had come to London for her grandmother's 80th birthday celebration, but the family gathering wouldn't start until evening. With hours to spare, she decided to explore the city that had always fascinated her through books and movies. Buckingham Palace seemed like the obvious choice for a history teacher from small-town Ohio. The guard stood at attention near the main entrance, his face hidden beneath the shadow of his bearskin hat. What caught Sarah's attention wasn't his perfect posture, or the shine on his boots. It was something in his eyes. Even from a distance, she could see a sadness that seemed deeper than the usual stoic expression guards were famous for maintaining. Sarah found herself walking closer, drawn by an inexplicable feeling that this person needed something she couldn't quite identify. Other tourists bustled around her, taking selfies and chattering excitedly about the palace's history. Children pressed their faces against the iron gates, hoping to catch a glimpse of royalty. But Sarah's focus remained fixed on the lone guard. She had read about these guards before coming to London. They were highly trained soldiers, often veterans of serious military service. Their job required them to stand motionless for hours, ignoring distractions, weather, and even harassment from inconsiderate tourists. They weren't supposed to react to anything, not jokes, not provocations, and certainly not attempts at conversation. As Sarah moved closer, she noticed other details about this particular guard. His uniform was impeccable, but there were tiny signs that spoke of something more personal. A small crease in his glove suggested nervous tension. The way he held his rifle showed years of training, but also a slight tremor that most people would never notice. His breathing, while controlled, had a rhythm that suggested he was fighting to maintain his composure. The morning crowd began to thin as people moved on to other attractions. Sarah remained, finding a bench nearby where she could observe without being obvious about it. She pulled out her phone and pretended to check messages, but her attention never wavered from the guard. There was something about him that reminded her of her students back home, particularly the ones who tried hardest to hide their struggles. During her 15 years of teaching, Sarah had developed an instinct for recognizing pain in others. She had seen it in teenagers dealing with family problems, in colleagues facing personal crises, and even in parents during difficult conferences. This guard had that same quality, a person holding himself together through sheer willpower while something inside was breaking. Other guards rotated in and out of various positions around the palace grounds, but this one remained at his post, longer than seemed normal. Sarah began to wonder if he had requested extra duty or if there was another reason he stayed in position. She noticed how other guards would glance his way occasionally, as if checking on him. Their expressions suggested concern rather than routine acknowledgement. The October sun climbed higher, bringing warmth that made Sarah remove her jacket. She imagined how uncomfortable it must be to stand in that heavy uniform, especially with the psychological weight the guards seemed to be carrying. She found herself wanting to do something, anything, to let him know that someone saw him as more than just a tourist attraction. Sarah had always been the type of person who acted on her instincts, sometimes to her own embarrassment. In college, she had once chased down a stranger to return a dropped wallet. At her school, she was known for staying after hours to help struggling students or to listen when colleagues needed someone to talk to. Her friends often joked that she had a radar for people in need. But this situation felt different. The guard was clearly a professional doing his job, and interfering could get both of them in trouble. Royal guards had strict protocols, and tourists were expected to maintain respectful distance. Yet something deep in Sarah's chest kept pulling her attention back to this one person who seemed to be fighting a private battle while surrounded by hundreds of strangers. As the morning progressed, Sarah noticed that the guard's perfect posture began to show tiny signs of strain. His shoulders, while still squared, carried a tension that seemed to increase with each passing minute. His breathing became slightly more labored, though still within the controlled parameters of his training. Most telling were his eyes. They had taken on a distant quality that Sarah recognized from her most troubled students. She began to formulate a plan that both terrified and excited her. It went against everything she knew about appropriate behavior around royal guards, and it could easily result in her being escorted away by security. But sometimes, Sarah believed, the right thing to do wasn't the safe thing to do. Sometimes, human connection mattered more than following rules. The decision crystallized when she saw the guard's hand tremble almost imperceptibly as he adjusted his grip on his rifle. It was such a small movement that she might have missed it if she hadn't been watching so carefully. In that moment, Sarah stood up from her bench and began walking toward him, her heart pounding with nervous energy but her resolve strengthening with each step. She had no idea what she would say or do when she reached him. She only knew that this person, this professional soldier trying so hard to maintain his composure, needed to know that someone cared enough to see past the uniform to the human being underneath. The consequences would have to take care of themselves. The guard's name was James Crawford, though Sarah would not learn this until much later. At 28 years old, he had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining the Grenadier Guards 3 years earlier. To the outside world, he represented the pinnacle of British military tradition, disciplined, unflappable, and utterly professional. Inside, he was falling apart. 3 weeks earlier, James had received news that changed everything. His younger sister Emma, the person who had written him letters throughout his deployments and welcomed him home with homemade cookies, had been diagnosed with late-stage cancer. The doctors gave her 6 months, maybe less. She was only 24 years old and had just gotten engaged to her college sweetheart. James had requested leave to be with his family, but the request was denied due to scheduling conflicts and upcoming state ceremonies. His commanding officer had been sympathetic but firm. Duty came first, and personal matters would have to wait until the rotation schedule allowed. James understood the military mindset that governed such decisions, but understanding didn't make the reality any easier to bear. Every morning for the past 3 weeks, James had put on his uniform and taken his position, carrying the weight of his sister's illness alongside his rifle. He had perfected the art of compartmentalization during his combat deployments, but this felt different. In Afghanistan, the enemy was external and identifiable. Here, he was fighting an internal battle that threatened to consume him from within. Thus, phone calls made it worse. Emma called every few days, her voice getting weaker with each conversation. She never complained about her treatment or the pain she was experiencing. Instead, she asked about his work, shared funny stories about their parents' attempts to spoil her, and talked about wedding plans she might not live to see fulfilled. Her strength made James feel both proud and heartbroken in equal measure. His fellow guards had begun to notice changes in his behavior. James had always been quiet, but lately he had become almost completely withdrawn. He volunteered for extra shifts, partly to distract himself and partly because standing still for hours felt like the only thing he could control. When other guards tried to engage him in conversation during breaks, he responded with polite but minimal answers. The irony wasn't lost on James that his job required him to stand perfectly still while everything inside him wanted to move. To run to his sister's bedside, to do something, anything, other than maintain this stoic facade. He had trained for years to ignore distractions and remain focused on his duty. But those distractions had always been external. No amount of training had prepared him for the way grief could attack from within. On this particular morning, James had received a text from his mother before his shift began. Emma had been admitted to the hospital again. The chemotherapy wasn't working as well as hoped, and the doctors wanted to try a more aggressive treatment. His mother's message was characteristically brief and strong, but James could read the fear between the lines. She was trying to protect him while dealing with her own terror about losing her daughter. Standing at his post, James found himself caught between two impossible worlds. Around him, tourists laughed and took pictures, treating his presence as part of the London experience. They had no way of knowing that beneath his perfect uniform was a man whose heart was breaking piece by piece. The disconnect between his internal turmoil and the cheerful atmosphere around him felt surreal. Several times that morning, James had felt his composure slip. His breathing would become shallow, his vision would blur slightly, and he would have to fight to maintain his position. These were the physical symptoms of anxiety and grief that he recognized from other soldiers who had struggled with similar challenges. The difference was that he couldn't seek help or even acknowledge what was happening without risking his career. The military had protocols for dealing with psychological stress, but accessing those resources meant admitting weakness. In a culture that prized strength above all else, James had seen what happened to soldiers who couldn't handle the pressure. They were quietly reassigned to less prestigious positions, their careers effectively over. He couldn't afford to lose this job, especially now when his family needed his financial support for Emma's medical expenses. As the morning wore on, James became increasingly aware of one tourist who seemed different from the others. While most visitors took their photos and moved on, this woman remained nearby, sitting on a bench and occasionally glancing in his direction. At first, he assumed she was waiting for someone or simply enjoying the autumn sunshine. But there was something in the way she looked at him that felt different. Less like curiosity about a tourist attraction and more like genuine concern. James had developed an almost supernatural awareness of the people around him during his combat deployments. It was a survival skill that helped him identify potential threats or unusual behavior. This woman wasn't threatening, but she was definitely unusual. Her attention felt personal rather than casual, as if she could somehow see past his uniform, to the person struggling inside. Under normal circumstances, James would have dismissed such observations as irrelevant to his duties. Royal guards were trained to notice everything while appearing to notice nothing. But today, fighting to maintain his emotional equilibrium, he found himself oddly comforted by this stranger's presence. It was as if someone in the bustling crowd actually saw him as a human being rather than a living statue. The feeling was both welcome and dangerous. James needed to maintain his professional demeanor, and allowing himself to be distracted by a tourist's attention could lead to mistakes. Yet something about this woman's quiet presence felt like a lifeline in an ocean of isolation. She represented a world where people cared about each other's well-being, where showing concern for a stranger wasn't a sign of weakness, but of humanity. When James saw the woman stand up and begin walking toward him, every training instinct told him to ignore her approach. Tourists often tried to interact with guards, and the proper response was to remain absolutely motionless and unresponsive. But today, fighting his private battle while surrounded by indifferent strangers, James found himself hoping that whatever this woman intended to do might offer even a momentary respite from his isolation. He had no way of knowing that Sarah Mitchell was about to change his life in ways that neither of them could have imagined. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she approached the guard. She had no plan, no script, no idea what she would do when she reached him. All she knew was that another human being was in pain, and every instinct she possessed told her that silence and distance weren't the answer. Her grandmother had always taught her that sometimes the smallest gestures could make the biggest difference in someone's life. The closer she got, the more details she could see. The guard's jaw was clenched so tightly that she could see the muscle tension beneath his skin. His eyes, which had seemed sad from a distance, now looked almost desperate. There was a quality to his stillness that spoke of enormous effort rather than natural calm. He was holding himself together through sheer force of will, and Sarah could sense that his reserves were running dangerously low. Other tourists continued to mill about, taking photos and chatting among themselves. Some noticed Sarah's approach toward the guard and assumed she was setting up for a picture. A few people even paused to watch, expecting some kind of typical tourist interaction. None of them could see what Sarah saw, a person on the edge of emotional collapse who was trapped by duty and protocol in a role that demanded perfection. When Sarah was just a few feet away from the guard, she stopped. Up close, she could see that he was younger than she had initially thought, probably not much older than some of her former students. There were tiny stress lines around his eyes that spoke of recent sleepless nights. His breathing was carefully controlled, but she could see the slight expansion and contraction of his chest that suggested he was working to maintain that control. For a moment, Sarah hesitated. What she was about to do went against every social norm she could think of. Royal guards were not supposed to be touched or interfered with in any way. She could be arrested, embarrassed publicly, or worse. But looking at this young man's face, seeing the pain he was trying so hard to hide, all those concerns seemed less important than the simple human need to offer comfort to someone who was suffering. Sarah stepped forward and, without a word, wrapped her arms around the guard in a gentle but firm embrace. The reaction was immediate and electric. James felt the woman's arms encircle him, and for just a moment, his carefully maintained composure cracked. It had been weeks since anyone had offered him physical comfort, months since he had felt truly seen by another person. The warmth of human contact, so simple and yet so profound, broke through the armor of professional distance he had built around his grief. Without thinking, James's body responded to the embrace. His rigid military posture softened slightly, and for just a few seconds, he allowed himself to accept the comfort being offered. It was a momentary lapse in his training, but it felt like the first real breath he had taken in weeks. The woman's hug wasn't romantic or inappropriate. It was the kind of embrace a mother might give a hurt child, or a friend might offer during a moment of crisis. The tourists around them stopped what they were doing. Some pulled out phones to record what they assumed was either a publicity stunt or a major breach of protocol. Others simply stared in amazement. Royal guards were famous for their ability to remain unmoved by any distraction, yet here was one who had not only allowed physical contact, but seemed to be accepting it willingly. Security personnel began moving toward the scene, but something in the quality of the interaction made them pause. This wasn't harassment or an attempt to create a scene. The woman's embrace was respectful, almost reverent. The guard's response, while unprecedented, didn't suggest distress or a security threat. The officers found themselves uncertain about how to proceed with a situation that broke all the rules while somehow feeling completely appropriate. Sarah could feel the guard's tension begin to ease under her touch. She had no idea what specific pain he was carrying, but she recognized the universal human need for connection and comfort. Her teacher's instincts, honed by years of working with people in crisis, told her that this person needed to know he wasn't alone. Whatever battle he was fighting, he had been fighting it in isolation for too long. The embrace lasted perhaps 15 seconds, though to both Sarah and James, it felt much longer. In that brief moment, the busy street, the curious onlookers, and the weight of protocol seemed to fade away. There was only one person offering comfort and another gratefully receiving it. It was one of those rare instances when human kindness transcended social boundaries and institutional rules. When Sarah finally stepped back, she looked directly into the guard's eyes. What she saw there confirmed her instincts. This was a person who had been carrying an enormous burden alone. His eyes, no longer hidden in the shadow of his hat, were bright with unshed tears. The professional mask he wore had slipped just enough to reveal the vulnerable young man underneath. James looked back at Sarah, trying to communicate with his eyes what he could not say with words. In that moment, he wanted nothing more than to thank her, to tell her how much her simple gesture had meant, to explain why he needed that human contact so desperately. But his training and duty held him in place, allowing only the briefest eye contact before he had to resume his stoic stance. The crowd around them seemed to hold its collective breath. Everyone sensed they had witnessed something extraordinary, though they couldn't quite define what it was. Some people began to applaud softly, recognizing the beauty of the moment, even if they didn't understand its full significance. Others remained silent, feeling privileged to have observed such a pure expression of human compassion. Security officers continued to approach, but their pace had slowed. The situation was clearly not dangerous, and the guard himself seemed to be handling it appropriately. They positioned themselves nearby, ready to intervene if necessary, but chose to let the moment unfold naturally rather than rush in and potentially escalate an otherwise peaceful interaction. Sarah stepped back further, giving the guard space to resume his duties while maintaining eye contact for just a moment longer. She wanted him to know that she saw him, not as a tourist attraction or a symbol of British tradition, but as a fellow human being deserving of kindness and support. Whatever he was going through, she hoped her gesture had reminded him that he wasn't facing it entirely alone. The transformation in the guard's posture was subtle but noticeable to those who looked carefully. While he returned to his professional stance, there was something different about his bearing. The desperate edge of his earlier tension had softened into something more manageable. He was still clearly dealing with serious personal challenges, but the crushing weight of complete isolation had been lifted, at least temporarily. As Sarah began to walk away, she had no idea that her spontaneous act of kindness had been captured by dozens of phone cameras and would soon spread across social media platforms around the world. More importantly, she had no way of knowing that her simple embrace had potentially saved a young man's life at a moment when he was close to giving up hope entirely. Within hours of Sarah's embrace, the moment had been captured and shared across every major social media platform. Videos taken from multiple angles showed the American woman approaching the stoic guard and wrapping him in what appeared to be a completely spontaneous hug. More remarkably, they showed the guard's subtle but unmistakable acceptance of the gesture, a response that defied everything people thought they knew about royal protocol. The reactions were immediate and polarized. Traditional royal watchers were scandalized, calling Sarah's behavior disrespectful and inappropriate. They argued that royal guards were working professionals deserving of the same respect afforded to any person on duty, and that tourists had no right to interrupt their service with unwanted physical contact. Comment sections filled with criticism about American tourists overstepping boundaries and treating British institutions like theme park attractions. But an equally vocal group defended Sarah's actions. These commenters saw something deeper in the viral footage, a moment of genuine human connection that transcended cultural boundaries and institutional protocols. They praised her ability to recognize someone in distress and respond with simple kindness. Many shared their own stories of times when a stranger's unexpected compassion had made a crucial difference in their lives. Military forums buzzed with discussion about the guard's response. Veterans recognized something in his body language that civilians might have missed. His acceptance of the embrace wasn't a breach of training. It was the reaction of someone who desperately needed human connection and found himself unable to refuse when it was offered. Former soldiers shared stories of their own moments of vulnerability and the importance of recognizing when duty needed to be balanced with humanity. The British press picked up the story within 6 hours. Initially, most outlets focused on the breach of protocol, interviewing royal experts about proper tourist behavior and the importance of maintaining respectful distance from working guards. But as more details emerged about the genuine nature of the interaction, the narrative began to shift toward the human element of the story. James Crawford found himself at the center of a media storm he neither wanted nor understood. His commanding officers called him in for debriefing, trying to determine whether disciplinary action was warranted. The conversation was complicated by the fact that James had not initiated the contact or encouraged the interaction in any way. He had simply responded as a human being to an unexpected gesture of kindness. During the debriefing, James made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of offering excuses or minimizing what had happened, he chose to be honest about his state of mind during the incident. He told his superiors about his sister's illness, the stress he had been under, and how isolated he had felt while trying to maintain his professional duties. It was a risk that could have ended his career, but James had reached a point where hiding his struggles felt more dangerous than revealing them. The response from his commanding officers was unexpected. Rather than punishment, James was offered immediate compassionate leave to be with his family. The military, despite its reputation for rigid protocol, had been quietly developing better support systems for soldiers dealing with personal crises. James's honest admission of his struggles provided an opportunity to demonstrate that the institution could balance duty with humanity. Meanwhile, Sarah had returned to her hotel room completely unaware that her spontaneous gesture had become international news. She had spent the rest of the day sightseeing with her family, visiting museums, and enjoying her grandmother's birthday dinner. It wasn't until late evening, when her phone began buzzing with messages from friends back home, that she realized what had happened. The messages ranged from supportive to concerned. Friends who knew Sarah well weren't surprised that she had reached out to help someone in distress. That was simply who she was. But they worried about the negative attention she might receive for her actions. Sarah read through dozens of social media posts about her interaction with the guard, many of which included speculation about her motives and character. What struck Sarah most profoundly was reading comments from people who had recognized something in the guard's demeanor that she had only felt intuitively. Veterans and current military personnel described seeing signs of someone struggling with grief or trauma. Their observations confirmed Sarah's instinct that the guard had needed human connection, even if protocol suggested otherwise. The story took an unexpected turn when a prominent British mental health advocacy organization issued a statement supporting both Sarah's actions and the guard's response. They used the incident to highlight the importance of recognizing when someone is in emotional distress and responding with compassion rather than judgment. The organization praised the guard for his honesty about his struggles and his willingness to accept help when it was offered. James's story became public when he gave an interview to a military magazine with the full support of his commanding officers. He spoke candidly about his sister's illness, the challenge of maintaining professional composure while dealing with personal grief, and how a stranger's unexpected kindness had reminded him that he didn't have to face his struggles alone. The interview humanized not just James, but royal guards in general, reminding people that behind the iconic uniforms were real people with real challenges. The interview also revealed that James had used his compassionate leave to spend time with Emma, whose condition had stabilized enough to allow her to return home from the hospital. The extra time together had been precious for both siblings, and Emma had been particularly touched to learn that a stranger's kindness had helped her brother when she couldn't be there for him herself. Public opinion began to shift as more details about the situation became clear. What had initially been viewed as either a breach of protocol or an act of kindness was now understood as something more complex, a moment when human need had trumped institutional expectations, and when both people involved had responded with grace and authenticity. The British royal family, through their representatives, issued a carefully worded statement acknowledging that while protocol was important, they also recognized the value of human compassion and the challenges faced by the dedicated soldiers who served as their guards. The statement was widely interpreted as support for both Sarah's actions and James's honest response to his personal difficulties. Social media discussions evolved from initial polarization to more nuanced conversations about the balance between professional expectations and human needs. Many people shared stories of times when they had struggled to maintain their composure while dealing with personal crises, and how much it had meant when someone had reached out with unexpected kindness. The incident also sparked broader conversations about mental health support for military personnel and the importance of creating environments where asking for help was seen as strength rather than weakness. James's willingness to be honest about his struggles and his commanding officer's supportive response provided a positive example of how institutions could better support their people during difficult times. As the story continued to spread, globally, it became less about protocol and more about the universal human need for connection and compassion. Sarah's simple gesture had created ripple effects that none of them could have predicted, touching lives far beyond that single moment. Outside Buckingham Palace, 3 weeks after the embrace that had captured the world's attention, Sarah received an unexpected phone call in her Ohio classroom. She was grading papers during her lunch break when her phone rang with an international number she didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was polite, formal, and unmistakably British. "Miss Mitchell, this is Sergeant Major Williams from the Grenadier Guards. I'm calling on behalf of Guardsman James Crawford. He would very much like to speak with you if you're willing." Sarah's heart skipped as she realized this was about the guard she had embraced. She had wondered many times what had become of him, whether her gesture had helped or caused him trouble, but she had never expected direct contact. The formal tone of the sergeant major's voice made her nervous about what might follow. "Of course," Sarah replied, setting down her red pen. "Is he all right?" "He's much better now, thanks in part to you," Sergeant Major Williams said, his professional demeanor softening slightly. "James has been granted leave to care for his sister, and he specifically requested permission to thank you personally. Would you be available for a call this evening, your time?" That evening, Sarah sat in her small apartment, staring at her phone and wondering what she would say to the young man whose life had briefly intersected with hers in such an unusual way. When the call came through, the voice was younger and warmer than she had expected, carrying a slight Northern English accent. "Miss Mitchell, this is James Crawford. I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," Sarah said, surprised by how nervous she felt. "Please, call me Sarah. How are you doing?" The conversation that followed was unlike anything Sarah had experienced. James told her about his sister Emma, about the fear and helplessness he had been feeling, and about how her spontaneous embrace had come at a moment when he was close to breaking down completely. His honesty was both heartbreaking and inspiring. "I know what you did was risky," James said. "You had no way of knowing how I would react or what kind of trouble you might get into. But somehow you saw that I needed help, and you offered it, without hesitation. I've been wanting to thank you for weeks." Sarah found herself crying as James described the days that had followed their encounter. The support from his commanding officers, the time with his sister, and the positive changes in military policy regarding mental health support for soldiers dealing with family crises. Her simple gesture had been the catalyst for much larger changes in how the institution supported its people. "How is Emma doing?" Sarah asked, having learned about his sister's illness from the media coverage. "Better than expected," James said, and Sarah could hear the smile in his voice. "The doctors are cautiously optimistic about her response to the new treatment. We've had time together that I never would have gotten without that leave. She's been following the story about you and me. She says you're her hero for looking after her big brother when she couldn't." The conversation lasted over an hour, ranging from serious discussions about family and duty to lighter exchanges about their respective homes and cultures. Sarah learned that James was an amateur photographer who hoped to pursue it professionally after his military service. James discovered that Sarah had always wanted to visit Scotland, having traced her family ancestry there. Near the end of their call, James made an unexpected invitation. "Sarah, Emma, and I have been talking, and we'd like to invite you to visit us when you're ready to return to England. We'd love to show you more of our country than just the tourist spots. Emma's particularly eager to meet the woman who helped her brother when he needed it most." Sarah was touched by the invitation but uncertain about accepting. The media attention had been overwhelming, and she worried about intruding on their family's private time. But James's earnest invitation and his description of Emma's eagerness to meet her made it hard to refuse. "I would love that," Sarah finally said. "But are you sure it won't be too much with everything your family is dealing with?" Emma insists. James laughed. "She says that anyone brave enough to hug a royal guard definitely has the courage to handle a cranky cancer patient. Those are her words, not mine." She's got a wicked sense of humor about her situation. Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself exchanging regular emails and text messages with both James and Emma. The correspondence gave her insight into their close-knit family and their determination to face Emma's illness with hope and humor. Emma's messages in particular were filled with wit and curiosity about Sarah's life as a teacher in small-town America. The media attention around Sarah's original gesture had largely died down, but the impact of the story continued to resonate. She received letters from veterans thanking her for showing kindness to a soldier in need. Teachers reached out to share their own experiences of following their instincts to help students or colleagues in crisis. The story had become a symbol of the importance of human connection and the power of simple gestures to change lives. Planning her return trip to England became an unexpected joy for Sarah. James and Emma sent her detailed recommendations for places to visit, from famous landmarks to hidden gems known only to locals. They planned a schedule that would allow Sarah to see the country through their eyes, while also giving Emma time to rest between social activities. The correspondence also revealed how much the original incident had changed James's approach to his military service. With proper support for his family situation, he was able to perform his duties with the dedication they required while also maintaining his emotional well-being. His commanding officers had praised his honesty about his struggles and his willingness to accept help when it was needed. "You taught me something important that day," James wrote in one of his longer emails. "I had convinced myself that being strong meant handling everything alone. But real strength sometimes means accepting help when it's offered, even from strangers." Emma's messages often included updates about her treatment and her determination to be well enough to properly welcome Sarah when she visited. Despite the seriousness of her illness, her correspondence was filled with plans for showing Sarah her favorite restaurants, introducing her to friends, and sharing stories about growing up with James as her protective older brother. The planned visit became more than just a reunion between Sarah and the guard she had embraced. It evolved into a celebration of the unexpected connections that can form between strangers and the way one moment of courage can create lasting bonds between people from completely different worlds. As Sarah booked her return flight to London, she reflected on how her simple act of reaching out to someone in distress had grown into something far beyond what she could have imagined. She was no longer just visiting England as a tourist. She was going to spend time with friends whose lives had become intertwined with hers through a 15-second embrace that had somehow changed everything for all of them. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the arrivals hall at Heathrow Airport, scanning the crowd for two faces she had only seen in photographs and video calls. Her heart raced with excitement and nervousness as she spotted them, James in civilian, clothes looking relaxed and happy, and beside him a petite young woman with a colorful scarf wrapped around her head and the brightest smile Sarah had ever seen. Emma Crawford moved forward first, her steps quick despite the obvious effects of her treatment. "Sarah!" she called out, her voice carrying a warmth that immediately erased any awkwardness about meeting for the first time. "I can't believe you're finally here." The hug Emma gave Sarah was fierce and grateful, quite different from the gentle embrace Sarah had given her brother months earlier. In that moment, Sarah understood that she wasn't just meeting James's sister. She was embracing someone who had become genuinely important to her through their correspondence and shared experience. James waited his turn, grinning broadly as he watched his sister's enthusiastic welcome. When Emma finally released Sarah, he stepped forward with characteristic British reserve, but his eyes were warm with genuine affection. "Thank you for coming," he said simply, offering a more formal handshake that quickly evolved into a warm hug. "Emma's been planning this visit for months. I hope you're prepared for the full Crawford family experience." The week that followed exceeded every expectation Sarah had formed during her months of correspondence with the Crawford siblings. They toured London with the expertise of locals, showing her hidden gardens tucked away behind busy streets, tiny pubs with centuries of history, and viewpoints that offered stunning perspectives on familiar landmarks. But more than the sightseeing, Sarah was struck by the resilience and joy the Crawford family brought to each day. Emma's cancer treatment was going better than anyone had dared hope. The aggressive therapy had been successful, and while she still faced months of recovery, her doctors were cautiously optimistic about her long-term prognosis. "I keep telling everyone that having an American fairy godmother must be good luck," Emma joked during dinner at a cozy restaurant in Covent Garden. "Ever since Sarah hugged my grumpy brother, everything started getting better." James rolled his eyes at his sister's teasing, but Sarah could see the profound relief in his expression. The desperate sadness she had glimpsed that October morning had been replaced by something much lighter. He still carried the serious demeanor of a professional soldier, but now it was balanced by genuine happiness and hope for the future. During their week together, Sarah learned more about the ripple effects of that single moment outside Buckingham Palace. The military had implemented new policies for compassionate leave, making it easier for soldiers to care for family members during medical crises. Mental health support had been expanded, with an emphasis on reducing the stigma around asking for help. "Your story became a teaching example," James explained as they walked through Hyde Park. "Not about breaking protocol, but about recognizing when humanity needs to take precedence over rigid rules. It's helped other soldiers feel more comfortable seeking support when they need it." The media attention had also led to unexpected opportunities. Sarah had been invited to speak at several conferences about the importance of recognizing mental health struggles and responding with compassion. She discovered a talent for public speaking that she never knew she possessed, finding ways to connect her experience as a teacher with her instinctive response to James's distress. Emma had become something of a celebrity herself, using her platform to advocate for young cancer patients and their families. Her combination of humor and honesty about her illness had resonated with thousands of people facing similar battles. She had started a blog that mixed updates about her treatment with observations about life, hope, and the importance of human connection. "I never wanted to be famous for being sick," Emma told Sarah during a quiet moment in her parents' garden. "But if my story helps other people feel less alone, then maybe there's purpose in it. Just like your hug helped James feel less alone when he needed it most." The visit also included meeting James and Emma's parents, who welcomed Sarah with the warmth typically reserved for family members. They credited her with saving their son during one of the darkest periods of their lives, when they had been too focused on Emma's illness to recognize how much James was struggling. "We were so worried about losing Emma that we didn't see how close we came to losing James too," their mother confided to Sarah. "He was drowning in his grief and sense of helplessness, but he didn't want to add to our burden by telling us how much he was struggling. Your kindness threw him a lifeline when he needed it most." On Sarah's last day in England, James took her back to Buckingham Palace. They stood at the exact spot where their lives had intersected 6 months earlier, watching the current guards maintain their stoic vigil. The tourists continued their eternal dance of photos and excitement, most unaware of the human stories behind the iconic uniforms. "Do you ever regret what you did?" James asked as they observed the familiar scene. Sarah considered the question seriously. The media attention had been overwhelming at times, and she had faced criticism from people who felt she had overstepped appropriate boundaries. But looking at James now, seeing the peace in his expression, and knowing about Emma's improved prognosis, she had no doubts about her answer. "Never," she said firmly. "Sometimes the right thing to do isn't the safe thing or the expected thing. You needed someone to see you as a person that day, not just as a symbol. I'm glad I trusted my instincts." As they prepared to say goodbye at the airport, Sarah realized that what had begun as a spontaneous gesture had evolved into one of the most meaningful relationships of her life. The Crawford siblings had become more than friends. They were chosen family, connected by a moment of vulnerability and kindness that had changed all of their lives. "This isn't goodbye," Emma insisted as they embraced for the final time. "You're stuck with us now. James and I are already planning to visit Ohio next year. I want to see where our American sister lives and works." The promise of future visits made the parting easier, but Sarah still found herself crying as her plane took off from Heathrow. She had come to England 6 months earlier as a tourist looking for a glimpse of royal pageantry. She was leaving as someone who had discovered the profound impact that simple human kindness could have when offered at exactly the right moment. Back in Ohio, Sarah returned to her classroom with new stories to share and a deeper understanding of the connections that bind people together across cultural and geographical boundaries. She had learned that sometimes the most important thing we can do is trust our instincts about when someone needs help, even when offering that help requires courage. The story of her embrace with the royal guard continued to inspire people around the world, but for Sarah, the real magic wasn't in the viral moment or the media attention. It was in the lasting friendships that had grown from 15 seconds of spontaneous compassion, and in the knowledge that sometimes reaching out to a stranger can change multiple lives in ways that none of them could have imagined. Years later, when Sarah told the story to her students, she always emphasized the same lesson: that every person we encounter is fighting battles we know nothing about, and that simple acts of kindness have the power to transform lives in ways we may never fully understand. The guard she had hugged that October morning had taught her just as much as she had helped him, proving that compassion is always a two-way street that enriches everyone it touches.